The Bible is not a science book, but it is a book that contains a lot of knowledge, of course focused on spiritual things, but spiritual things sometimes have a few things to do with physical things, and so it does make scientific statements. We've been talking about how important it is that the Bible has certain features that we would expect if it really were from God. Well, one of those features is that it's not going to make a scientifically faulty statement. In fact, it's going to be scientifically accurate when we would expect it to be scientifically inaccurate if it were man-made because of the day it was written. But what we find with it is that's not the case. And we call this concept scientific foreknowledge. That's what we'll be talking about today on The Gospel Call, brought to you by the Purcellville Church of Christ. The purpose of the Bible is not to enlighten us for our physical ignorance and our lack of understanding of the natural world. It is to enlighten us, at least in part, for our spiritual ignorance. But occasionally, of course, there are references to the things that are physical. When Jesus would teach, one of the most common metaphors he would use would be referencing farming. Well, the parable of the sower only works if we have a basic understanding of farming, and if Jesus had a basic understanding of farming, that when you plant a seed, it needs to be on good ground or it won't grow. Well, the same concept applies to different things in the Bible that might just be offhandedly mentioned, but they're so crucially important to our scientific understanding. Now, it's a common criticism of the Bible that it gives bad scientific information. However, when that point is pressed, we find that the supposed points of bad scientific information are few and far between. Some, for example, have asserted that the Bible teaches that there is a flat earth because it occasionally mentions the four corners of the earth. Well, the solution here isn't particularly difficult. It's a metaphor used to help understand the entirety of the world. We have to try pretty hard to make this a literal meaning of what the Bible is trying to say. Just about as hard as if we were going to say that the Bible says that Jesus was a literal gate because he said, "I am the gate." Obviously, he was speaking in metaphor, and obviously the four corners of the world is a metaphor. And if you think that's a strange metaphor, consider that it's partially, anyway, a metaphor we kind of still use today. There are four cardinal directions: north, south, east, west. Those are the reference of the four corners of the earth. The Bible does not teach a flat earth. You sort of have to force that to be the case. But if you come at the Bible with an open mind, you find that's not the case. The Bible does not give bad scientific information. Again, I can't stress this enough. It's not a science book. The purpose of it isn't to give us scientific information, but when it mentions scientific information, it is always accurate. And sometimes it's astounding because of how different it is from the scientific information of the day. Let me give you a couple of examples, both in the book of Leviticus, that is written by the prophet Moses. One of these examples is Leviticus chapter 12 and verse 3, in which the Bible reads, "And on the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised." Now this is talking about a law concerning the birth of a new child. When a new male child is born, famously one of the laws of Judaism was that they were to be circumcised. But it's curious the timing. Why is it that they have to wait till the 8th day of life to circumcise? Well, something that people at that time had no way of knowing, but we scientifically understand now, is that on the 8th day of life, the body has peaked in its production of vitamin K, which is essential in blood clotting. As you can imagine, circumcision is a rather bloody process, and if done improperly, you are running the risk of bleeding the child to death. So God gives a safety rule. On day 8, that is when you circumcise. Let's look over to the very next chapter in Leviticus 13, beginning in verse 45. The Bible reads, "The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes, and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip, and cry out, 'Unclean, unclean.' He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp." Now, at the time of recording, we're still living during the COVID-19 pandemic, and so some of the advice here should seem pretty familiar. If somebody has leprosy, a contagious disease, what they're supposed to do is take their hand when they are near others, cover up their, it says upper lip, but you think about the size of your hand, that's going to cover your mouth as well as your nose. Sort of like wearing a mask today. He's supposed to cover his mouth, and he is supposed to shout unclean, and he's not supposed to live with anybody else. Now, is this to shame him? Is this supposed to be a exercise in humiliation? Well, no. This is social distancing. A concept that's fairly basic for us now, but it's only relatively recent within history that we have fully begun to understand how pathogens spread between person to person and how these things will work for that. So why is it that thousands of years before Christ, Moses is writing these things and he understands them? Is it his education? We do have reason to believe that Moses was a highly educated man. He was a member of the Egyptian royal family growing up, and so he would have had the best schooling that Egypt had at that time. And certainly, without a doubt, there was a lot of intelligence and knowledge within ancient Egypt, some of which we still don't have. They were doing impressive things. I believe it was said that they did a few brain surgeries, and of course the famous thing more than anything is that they built the pyramids, a feat that if we were given the exact same technology today that they had then, we would not be able to duplicate. So clearly they weren't stupid, but that doesn't mean that they weren't ignorant on a few things and had some hugely false misconceptions. They also famously would use crocodile dung as contraception. Yeah. Obviously, they're not all the way up on every cutting edge of science. But you'll notice you'll see nothing like that in the Old Testament. You'll never find something so silly as, crocodile dung. You're not going to see bad scientific advice within the Old Testament. In fact, there is some science within the Old Testament that has been applied within, once again, fairly recently modern times to help us make discoveries. Matthew Fontaine Maury is largely credited with discovering the shipping lanes in the oceans that we still use today. And the credit that he gives to making those discoveries, and this was in the 19th century, by the way, but the credit that he gives is he had the idea to look for them when he was reading Psalm 8. Verse 8 of Psalm 8 says, "The birds of the heavens and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the sea." When he read that almost innocuous phrase, the paths of the sea, he decided to look for them. Sure enough, he started studying the ocean currents and found out that, yes, there are quote-unquote roadways within the sea. Now, the psalmist lived in around 1000 BC. As far as he knew, the oceans in the world at least from a physical man's perspective, the oceans in the world covered the Mediterranean Sea, the Red Sea, and then some of the inland seas up in Europe, and perhaps he might have known about the Atlantic Ocean on the west side of Africa and Europe, but he certainly wouldn't have known its full extent. No way of knowing about the quote-unquote pathways in the sea. Now, these are just a few examples of the scientific foreknowledge of the Bible. Why is it that these men were able to understand things about the world around them years and years before they should have? It's because the words of the Bible aren't actually originating with man. They're originating with God, who understands the world perfectly. There are a few other examples we could go to. The Bible mentions the existence of dinosaurs, which we didn't know about for quite some time. The Bible has knowledge of so many scientific concepts that we're still figuring out just now. See if you can find a contemporary book that understands the world the way the Bible does. Some of the things, I'm sure, didn't seem to make sense, but now we have an understanding. And the Bible cannot merely be the work of man who can only work with the knowledge that they have at the time. If you have any questions or comments about what we've said today, or anything we've said so far, or anything really biblical related you want to talk about, shoot us an email at thegospelcallpodcast, all one word, @gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. For the Purcellville Church of Christ, I'm DJ Kessinger. Thank you so much for listening.